So now that we've had an opportunity to build custom textures that tile across an object, let's take a look at building custom textures that fit an object in a unique way. So there may be a scenario where, for example, on this cube, maybe we have a scenario where we want to have grass on top of the cube, and the side of the cube kind of transitions into some kind of dirt and rock. In order to do that, we'll need to build a custom texture that maps directly to the UV coordinates of a 3D object, and we can do that directly in Cinema 4D using BodyPaint. Now, I'm going to jump into Cinema 4D, and I'm going to use the BodyPaint module, and this is intended just to kind of point you in the direction of getting up and running using BodyPaint. This is an optional process, but it is very valuable if you build a custom model. Maybe you build a car or a tree, and you want to integrate that into Unity, and you want a custom texture that wraps around the object in a very specific way. We can do that using the BodyPaint module. In order to demonstrate this, I'm going to start off by building just a simple cube. So I'll generate a cube inside Cinema 4D, and I'm going to build this to the same scale that we're using in Unity. So I'm going to build this at 1 meter or 100 centimeters according to Cinema 4D. And once I get this object in place, I'm going to start the procedure to get this object into BodyPaint. Now, the way to do this is that I gotta have geometry. I gotta have a polygon object rather than a parametric primitive. So I'm going to convert that object to make it editable. And once I have an editable object and I have it selected, what I'll do is I'll go to the Layout pull-down menu and I'll choose to go to BP UV Edit or BodyPaint UV Edit. Now, once I enter the BP UV Edit mode, I'm basically looking at a reorganized Cinema 4D interface, and I'm presented with a couple more options to influence and modify and edit the UV maps. Now, the first step in the process, once I get into BP UV Edit, is I want to generate a UV map. And so I'll run this through the Paint Setup Wizard. And so I'll just find this icon with the paintbrush and the stars, and I'll click on that. I'm going to let the first step default. So you'll notice that it's looking at the only object that I have in my scene. In this case, it's the cube. And I'll hit the next button. Step 2, I'm going to let it default. I'll hit next. And in the third step, this is where I want to make some choices. I want to set the minimum and maximum texture size, and currently my maximum texture size is 1024. I'll let that default, but I'm going to set the minimum texture size to 1024. So basically what I'm telling BodyPaint is that when I generate this texture, this UV map, make sure that it's 1024 pixels square, no bigger and no smaller. Otherwise, I'm going to let everything else default, and I'll hit Finish and Close. Now, once I do that, I can actually start painting directly on this 3D object. Now, the BodyPaint interface, on the left side we have the 3D interface, and this works just like the standard 3D interface in Cinema 4D. And on the right side we have a 2D interface of the UV mesh. Now, currently I don't see anything, I just see a texture, but if I go to the UV menu and I tell it to show mesh, what I see is the UV mesh. And the UV mesh is basically a two-dimensional representation of the polygons that make up this object. So to demonstrate this, as I start to paint around on the object, so I have the brush tool selected, and I'm just gonna paint, and as I paint, you can see that I'm painting on one face of the object, and that's represented by a two-dimensional UV, or a representation of the polygon in a two-dimensional form. As I paint on the other side, you can see I'm on another part of the mesh. If I paint on the top, you can see that there's these different areas of my texture. Now, I actually don't want to start to paint on this object while this UV mesh looks like this, because I want this to be a little bit more of a seamless mesh. So I'm just going to undo. I'm going to Command Z and undo. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that I'm in polygon mode. Okay, so just like if I was in the standard interface, I want to use polygons. The buttons have moved a little bit here. I'm going to go to the Direct Select tool, or the Live Select tool, and I want to make sure that I have all these polygons selected. And I'll just Command A. So I now have all the polygons selected, or I could manually select them. I just want to make sure that the entire object is selected. So I'll Command A to select that. And once I have all the polygons selected on the object, I can remap them. And what I'll do is I'll focus on the bottom right hand corner, and I can see there's a UV mapping tab. And this allows me to control how this 3D object becomes unwrapped to be represented as a two-dimensional texture. And there's some presets over here. If I go to UV mapping, and I'm going to go to the projection tab of the UV map, and you can see that there's some basic shapes here. And if I choose cubic, it looks like everything disappears, but if I choose cubic 2, you can see that the cube ends up unfolding, but the texture is one continuous UV map, okay, that's unfolded. So it's kind of like if we took a razor knife and cut open the box and left it all attached. And so once I lay it flat like this, I have the option, I have these seams on each one of these polygons that are connected to each other, and that'll be very helpful when I'm creating this texture. And so now at this point, I could grab my paintbrush and I could start to paint over here, and I could just, you know, paint directly on this object and build up a texture that I want to use. I'm going to undo that because if I'm looking in the body paint interface, just next to the UV mapping tab, there's a layers tab. And if I click on the layers tab, we have a layer setup much like we have inside Photoshop. And I have some basic functionality down here where I can create a new layer. And just like in Photoshop, when I'm creating content inside Photoshop, I always want to preserve content to its own layer. So I'm working in a non-destructive way. So if I start to paint a base color here and I make a mistake, I can always go back and erase without having to work on all the content on the same layer. It'll be a little bit easier to work with. In addition to that, we have the ability to take this texture outside of the body paint interface and actually open it up in Photoshop if we decide later. And in order to do that, we're going to need to reference what the UV map is. Okay, so at this point, if I select my layer 1 and I just do a real quick illustration, and you can see I can paint directly on this this 3D cube. And I'll just paint really quickly, and I'll bump my brush up, and you can see that I can work back and forth between the two-dimensional mesh and the three-dimensional mesh, and I'm getting some real-time updates in both the windows. But if I were just to try to make the top of this cube white, okay, just as an example, I can do that directly in body paint. And if I show or hide the mesh, if I open this texture up in Photoshop, I won't see a representation of that UV mesh. Okay, so I'm just gonna, I could show or I could hide. But if I go back down to the layers panel, I want to point out that there's an icon. It's the second over from the right here. If I roll my mouse over, it tells me that I can create a UV mesh layer. And what that does is when I generate the UV mesh layer, it creates a new layer, and in pixels, it renders with pixels, so it just renders based on the color we have selected, a representation of that UV mesh. So if I zoom in on it, I can see what that UV mesh is, and I can turn it on and turn it off. And that'll be very helpful if I decide to go into Photoshop with this texture. Now, before I do, I'll just explore body paint a little bit, because body paint has a lot of functionality built into it. In fact, it's very much like Photoshop that's been crammed directly into Cinema 4D. And in fact, there's a lot of advantages of working directly in body paint rather than going to Photoshop. But in some cases, you might feel more comfortable doing certain things in Photoshop, and I'll just share with you a couple of those processes. So I'm going to create a new layer, and I'll just temporarily hide that initial layer that I was painting on, and I'll call this new layer green. And I'll make another layer, and I'll call this brown, and these will just be my base colors. In fact, I'll just kind of drag these layers around. I want green on top and brown on the bottom. So I'll start with the brown layer. I have my 3D paintbrush selected. By the way, I have a clone tool, I have a eraser tool, I have a gradient tool, and there's a lot of tools here that are very similar to what's going on in Photoshop. Once I have my brush selected, I can adjust the brush attributes using the attributes panel. And if I go over to where the Objects menu is, I can select the Colors tab, and from here I can adjust the color that my paintbrush is using. Now, before I start painting, I want to point out that a lot of the panels that we're looking at are the same panels that we saw in the standard view of Cinema 4D. We have our Object panel. We're just used to seeing that over here in the top right-hand corner. Beneath that, we're used to seeing the Attributes Manager, so we're really looking at our interface that's just kind of rearranged. Down here in the bottom right, we have some new panels that we haven't been, we might not be used to looking at, and these are pretty much presented when we're looking at the BodyPaint UV setup. Okay, the top right-hand corner is the two-dimensional UV map view, and then of course we have the 3D view over here. So I'm going to jump back into my color tab, and that'll allow me to adjust the color that I'm using for my paintbrush. So I'll just choose a brown color, and I can go back and just start painting directly on my object. I'm going to adjust the hardness of my brush so I can fill this a little bit faster. And again, I could work back and forth. I could work directly to the 3D object. Once I get a reference of what it is that I'm actually working on, I could jump into back and forth between the 2D and the 3D. So I'll just paint really quickly. So I've filled in that brown there. I'm going to jump to the green layer. I'll just choose a different color here, and just really quickly I'll just rough in the real basic content I want on these two layers. Okay, so at that point I could have done this directly on the 3D object or 2D, or I could work back and forth between the 2D and the 3D. And when I'm playing around with body paint, it really helps to familiarize yourself with the different tools that are available. We have lots of different components in here. We have a whole filter menu that's very similar to what we can find inside Photoshop. We have our layers panel. We really want to emphasize working in layers here. But right now I already have a basic texture that's set up. It's mapped specifically to this cube. And at this point I want to do a quick file save as. And I'll save this directly to the desktop, and I'll save this as cube. I'll call it UV01. So it's a UV mapped cube with a specific texture to it. And I'll just set this up in a new folder. I'll call it cube, so it's not running free on my desktop. And I'll save it, and I'll say yes. And let me just see what Cinema 4D generated for me. So when I go into the folder, I have a cubes UV01 Cinema 4D file, and I have a TIFF file. And this is a layered TIFF file that Cinema 4D is outputting, and that's a file that I could open up in Photoshop. So I'm going to launch Photoshop just for a moment here. I'll revisit Photoshop in a few minutes. But as I'm working inside BodyPaint and I'm generating a layered TIFF file, if I want to, as I'm updating this file, so if I continue to paint, I could just go File, Save Texture, and I can continue to update that texture as I work on it. Or I could choose Save Texture As, and then I can choose lots of different file types. And in fact, I could save this directly to a Photoshop document, but the TIFF PSD layered file as the default will do just what I want it to do. So now remember, when I originally generated this file, I created a UV mesh layer, okay, and I'll see that when I open that back up in Photoshop, but I'll do that in the next presentation.